večer svima. Ja sam prvi put zapravo domaćinska host u Galeriji umjetnina i odmah zahvaljujem Jasminki Babić, našoj ravnateljici, na gostoprimstvu. Ja sam Nataša Boljevažić, znači iz udruge Slobodne veze, ali predavanje je dosta vezano uz naš projekt Motor koji se bavi kritičkom reevaluacijom i zaštitom modernističke arhitekture druge polovice 20. stoljeća. Međutim, od 2020. godine smo imali jedan evropski projekt koji se zove Flowing Connections i događao se u Dresdenu, Budimpešti, Kaunasu, evo sad u Splitu. Kurirali smo Bijenala suvremene umjetnosti Australe od 21. Bio je otvoreni poziv i imali smo oko 130 umjetničkih pozicija, jednu veliku izložbu. Međutim, zajednička priča i Dresdena, Budimpešte, Kaunasa i Splita, odnosno Motor projekta, jesu napušteni ili polunapušteni modernistički prostori, koji su, iako nismo znali da će to biti okosno, su nekako postala okosnica ovog projekta. Ono što uglavnom evropski projekti u nekoj svojoj, na neki način pomalo dosadnoj birokratskoj priči imaju tu predstavljanje rezultate ili predstavljanje trogodišnje akcije. Ima i naš projekt, ali meni je bilo logično da to ipak nekako prepletemo sa našom dugogodišnjom praksom, jer projekt Motor traje više od 10 godina i jako puno smo napravili od zaštite određenih građevina do komunikacija. Tako da sam ja htjela ipak napraviti neki smisleni projekt, tako program u Splitu i tako smo u ponedjeljak imali jedan backstage kako raditi, backstage view ili moment kako raditi veliko bijenale suvremene umjetnosti sa baš nekakvim kustoskim expozingom, ukazivanjem na neke slabe točke cijelog tog procesa. Imali smo danas, recimo, na dan oslobođenja Splita i rođendan Splita 3 jednu turu u Splitu 3, naime 70. godine na današnji dan je postavljen kamen temeljac. Sutra idemo u Trogir vidjeti litičar motor koji smo zaštitili zajedno sa lokalnim konzervatorima i dječje lječilište Vikana Noglasovića u Krvarici. Ako neko želi u 11 sati, možete besplatno otići s nama u Krvaricu, krećemo ispred hotela Park na Bačvicama.
Kada je povratak?
U 2, 1, 2, tako nešto.
Jedan od tamo ili jedan tu?
Znaš šta, 1 sat je do tamo, 1 sat sigurno će trajati vodstvo i 1 nazad, tako da izračunamo u 2. I uglavnom, sad je vrijeme možda da završim s ovom pričom o nama i predstavim našu večerašnju gošću. Marija Dremaite, I will just speak two more sentences in Croatian. No, actually I will switch it. So, I met first time Marija Dremaite in 2012 in Vienna, in Architecture Center, where she was part of the very inspiring conference, the Soviet Modernism Unknown Stories, which was the first overview of actually new researchers dealing with the new heritage, actually first historization and some sort of exchange about today's views on the Soviet heritage in the architectural sense. Then I invited her to write for our publication Politics of Feeling, Economies of Love. She wrote beautiful text about wedding and funeral palaces in Lithuania. And then today she will present us actually a very, how would I say, new thing that is very much promoted by European Culture Capital Kaunas 2022, and it's dealing with interwar modernism in Kaunas, second big city in Lithuania, and its influences on the second half of the century modernism. It's an interesting story. The main point is that during 1920, when Vilnius was occupied at the moment, and Kaunas took over the role of the capital, somehow in this 20 years or something, it was built from kind of provincial to modern, a modernist city. So actually Marija will tell us a story about this, and for me, I really think modernism is the connecting point of so geographically distant areas, such as Kaunas and Split, the only logical one that I found at that moment. So, Marija, the floor is yours. And the mic.
Yeah. Thank you, Natasha, for inviting me. Yes, you reminded about this exhibition and conference in Vienna in 2012, and one more important thing that was the basic line of that exhibition and conference was that national republics that were in the Soviet Union were presented as separate styles and as different stories without Russia, and the floor was given to tell their own stories, which was now, today it is very relevant. And from that conference, a lot of new books, new researches, new topics developed. And one topic I think is still this decolonizing East Central Southern European art, which we are still dealing in our countries, I think. So that could be one connecting point. And thank you for inviting today to visit Split 3. It was a fascinating trip, and since I also research mass housing, it was very interesting for me to see all these things and meet people from the flowing connections. So today's talk is probably more like among colleagues and researchers. So I won't be reading something important. I will be commenting pictures, showing you pictures and commenting. And usually architecture of optimism, the Kaunas Phenomenon story is one topic. But thanks to Natasha, she asked me to develop further. So I will go further in what happened after this success or happy story in the second half of the 20th century. And I should be sitting, but I feel better when I stand with you. I can take it just for the record. I will develop on two books that I have written after this conference in 2017 and 18. They were published. So one is dedicated to the edited volume Architecture of Optimism, dedicated to this phenomenon of Kaunas. Why is it optimism? I will talk just in a few minutes. And another is about the Baltic modernism, architecture and housing in Soviet Lithuania. So about this post-war modernist heritage. Architecture of optimism. Why was it called like that? In 2017, I was commissioned to curate the exhibition about modernist architecture of Kaunas, which was on the interest, on the wave, and with several group of curators, my co-curators, art historians and designer and copywriter, we thought, how can we present this story can we find some universal element in it that anybody could relate to it? Because the brief was that we should make an international traveling exhibition that could travel the world and promote Kaunas Modernism. But when you look at Kaunas Modernism, it's not entirely what you expect when you think Bauhaus or Le Corbusier. No, it's something different. And it's not the proper modernism if you follow the central and peripheral stories. So we thought that optimism sounds like an architectural style, but it's not. It's more the state of mind. And I think this picture by female photographer Veronika Vera Šleivytė from 37 very well represents this state of mind that in the background she still has a kind of provincial city with an Orthodox church, which in Catholic Lithuania was certain imperial legacy from the Tsarist Russian Empire. but in the front she is sitting, sunbathing, happy, free woman. She is an opera singer. She is sitting in the roof terrace, which is made of concrete. So she already has these optimistic modernist aspirations and views. And so we thought that optimism as a context could be a very good idea, because Kaunas of the 30s reflects this modernist universal aspiration for a better future through rational planning and modern architecture, and political, social, economic, cultural optimism that flourished in newly established European nation states after the collapse of empires and World War I. The new residents of the Lithuania's provisional capital transformed the city into a modern and elegant European capital in less than 20 years. And I rely on this book, Races to Modernity, Metropolitan Aspirations in Eastern Europe from 1890 to 1940s. And I think in this case we can it relates to many European countries, especially those who became new states after the collapse of empires. So this geopolitical aspect was also very interesting, because Kaunas had a unique status in this 20 years period from 1919 to 1939, that of a provisional capital, because all the new European nation states had territorial problems of defining themselves. And Vilnius became, independent Lithuanian state was proclaimed in Vilnius in 1918. But because of the territorial conflicts with Bolshevik Russia, with Poland, it was not defined, and finally in 1920, Vilnius was annexed to Second Polish Republic. So immediately, unexpectedly, Kaunas became the provisional capital, and we see that it used this opportunity to the full. But not first in the architectural style. Of course, modernity was the aspiration of all these new nation states in building new image of the capital cities and of the state. But here we can see that this infrastructural urban transformation and modernization, with bringing modern facilities like sewage system, waterworks, modern transportation, paved streets, etc., was also important and played an important role in creating this image of a modern city. And you can see how this, the new waterworks in the 30s were built. Another thing was planning, urban planning, modern urban planning, how to make this city, how to transform this city into the modern capital. Usually it was with the help of foreign expertise. And for Kaunas, the urban planner from Denmark, from Copenhagen, Marius Franzen, was invited. But it's interesting that he was invited first of all to plan Kaunas sewage and water system. And only then he said, if we make these plans without urban planning, then the new construction can conflict with those lines of engineering infrastructure. So we need to make a new urban plan. And you can see that he actually, it's also economic problems with the cities urban, because this area is from the 1840s. It's the imperial plan of Kaunas. But the new area on the hill, which they were planning, already followed the garden city principles. Completely new idea. And using the terrain possibilities of Kaunas, they actually created interesting modernism in the nature feeling. Construction boom was another important thing, that in a city of 90 or 100,000 residents, 12,000 construction permits were released during those 20 years. area of the city expanded 7 times. Population almost doubled to reaching 155,039. And this fever of construction was also reflected by cartoonists, of course, as some spreading disease, because the crisis or shortage of apartments, of living space, inspired people to invest in housing, first of all. So we can see that there were civic initiatives in investing for building housing for profit, municipal initiatives for improving the infrastructure, engineering infrastructure, first of all, and governmental initiatives that, in the beginning, halted. So now we can see that this construction boom resulted in the really different image of Kaunas in 1937, of a modern European green capital. But for that, the national technical elite had to be raised, and quickly. Because in 1919, Kaunas started with very few practicing architects, and none of them were modernists as we imagine, and you can see 2 generations. The first generation of academic architects who were mostly trained in St. Petersburg because of the imperial schools, and the new generation trained in Bauhaus and everywhere, but because of the state initiative, it was Lithuanian state scholarship program for studies in Western Europe, and we can see that it was really a planned and very conscious direction to train the new generation of administrators and specialists in Western Europe. Almost 60 architects and construction engineers of practice in 400 had obtained their degrees in Berlin Technical School, Bauhaus, Rome, Prague, Paris, Grenoble, Brussels, Ghent, and everywhere. And by the 30s, they came back and they started, they initiated this change already in style. But provisional modernity still had its own unique features. For example, the elite of Kaunas thought that investing in governmental buildings would mean that government resigned from taking back Vilnius, the historical and real capital. And you can see that all important President's Palace, government building, and other important ministries were located in the imperial period buildings from the 19th century because they were waiting for Vilnius to come back and building the real capital there. It's interesting that it's the design for the Latvian embassy in Kaunas. And the plot for that was only bought in 1938, and it was again, it had a geopolitical reason. In 1938, Lithuania signed the diplomatic agreement with Poland, and it meant that Lithuania resigns from Vilnius. And only then the diplomatic residences started to be planned in Kaunas. Another important thing for these new nation-states, new capitals, were getting rid of imperial legacy. What to do with the Orthodox Church in the central street of Kaunas? In Warsaw, they blew it up in 1920, immediately. But in Kaunas, they were reluctant and they waited and maybe we can reuse it. And you can see the debate in the 1930s still, because when the restoration was proposed, part of people said, why should we invest in this legacy of Tsarist occupation? We should get rid of it. But it still stands in Kaunas and it's converted now to the Catholic Church. And I think one of the most important features for these new national modernities was how to combine the internationalism of modern movement and aspiration for the national identity, which these countries still wanted to propagate, to spread through Europe or entire world. And entire 2 decades are dedicated for the search of national style. Of course, some were primitive, like using historical styles or ethnographic elements. But then you can see that in Kaunas, especially in public buildings, you can meet exterior, which is modern, and interior, which is interpreted in the national tradition. For example, the floor tiling in the central post office is put in the ethnographic textile pattern, etc. Or in the office for the military cultural house, we could say, there is a lot of symbolism in sculpture, in decoration, and in representative rooms, which connect the medieval aristocratic Grand Duchy of Lithuania from the 15th century. Somehow it is represented in English Gothic. And then the connection for the contemporary president's room, which should have reflected the contemporary modern national style. And you can see how it was finally designed using only local materials, like oak from the region, textiles from the region, etc. Even in such a pragmatic or economic building like the Chamber of Industry, Trade and Crafts, from the exterior you can see the modern style, but in the interior it is still a lot of interpretation of ethnographic elements in a modern way. And probably the biggest headache was the national church. The church, which was supposed to be the national pantheon, but also the memorial church for the anniversary of Lithuania's independence. And this is the architectural competition in 1928 and 1932. These are designs by the same architect, who in the beginning he thought that this is the national style, and then he went for this, and finally it was built up on the hill, and as a Stadtkrone sort of the entire city. And the same 38. It is interesting that after this Polish ultimatum and restoration of diplomatic ties with Poland and resignation of Vilnius, official resignation of Vilnius, immediately the competition was announced for the state palace, which had to house the president's institution and the national council. And it attracted 54 entries from entire Europe. And you can see that in this year already you can see this state modernism or neoclassical or very already going reminding something in the Albert Speer's or Mussolini style. But in those 12,000 permits, there were a lot of different things. For example, functional modernization, which did not have this burden of looking more national or announcing something. It was functional modernization, like the sports palace or hybrid administrative buildings. I think this was done because of the economy, and it housed the land bank on one side and foreign ministry on the top floor with a separate entrance. Or another interesting building which housed Kaunas County Municipality on one entrance and the State Security Department on the other. So it's geniusly architect combined two buildings into one by making this connection of the geometric elements. and other buildings, but schools probably were the most important in this period because it was a strong belief that education will change and will nurture the nation. And education had to be changed from the beginning, from the start up till the university. And you can imagine that these white concrete buildings in the wooden environments look like ocean liners of modernity in different boroughs of Kaunas. But what's even more interesting that in the school design, you can see that Kaunas was still a multicultural city, although it was built as a nation-state capital, as a very Lithuanian city. But the Lithuanians made only 60% of all residents, and there were Jewish population, Russian, Polish, and in the Russian gymnasium you can see some national styles, or Jewish gymnasium designed by Baruch Klink has very international Bauhaus stylistics. But the most important thing was the major, what constituted the Kaunas modernity was housing. 7,000 permits actually were released for houses, and we can see that it's a modern city based on housing, or housing-based urban planning, that's how it is. There were multi-story tenement houses, lots of them. Again, one important and very interesting thing, that from the outside, from the exterior, they really looked or wanted to look very modern. But inside, we see these aspirations of Kaunas bourgeoisie to be more cozy, more luxury, more art deco, we would say, what we could see. And especially financial elites of Kaunas installed rooms, dedicated rooms of national style, as you can see in this hall by the the richest industrialist, Jonas Vailokaitis. Small apartment houses were another feature of Kaunas because of the housing crisis, or the townhouses for this Ilina's family were inside. Again, we can see very rich, luxurious Art Deco interior. And one thing, this porthole window, which is the common element of international modernism, anybody can recognize it, but you can see that it's covered with the two curtains, and it's to make it more cozy, so to appropriate, to customize it. And when we made this traveling exhibition of architecture of optimism, we also made a big light reminding this porthole window, and the two curtains just to represent that it's Kaunas modernism. It's more cozy than the international modernism. Approach towards modernism changed, of course, and this is a good proof that this apartment house by Jewish industrialists Taube and Mose Elstein, designed by Kaunas Jewish architects Leiba Zimanas and Izaokas Trakmanas, was awarded as the most beautiful facade. So it was changing, and leading industrialists or financial elites started to be building really modernist villas. But this majority of buildings were still cheap wooden houses, because it was much more cheap to build wooden houses of material which was on site. And an interesting feature of Kaunas modernism would be this wooden modernism. Wooden houses with corner windows, porthole windows, etc. How the story ended. The story ended abruptly, as well as it started. In 1919, in January the 2nd, government of 8 people had to relocate to Kaunas immediately from Vilnius because of the Bolsheviks coming. But in 1939, in September, you know that the war started. The Second World War started, and Stalin and Hitler, or in the form of Molotov and Ribbentrop, had signed a special pact of dividing Europe, and Poland became occupied from both sides. And Vilnius became the property of Soviet Union because it was in their part of Poland, and Soviet Union generously donated Vilnius to Lithuania, but behind the Soviet troops came in. So on one side, this meeting in Kaunas in the beginning of October 39 is a happy event that Vilnius is finally back. But it has some kind of sadness that Vilnius is ours, but we are of Russians now. And all these occupations that followed the first Soviet occupation, then the Nazi occupation, then the Soviets again, resulted in the desolation of this happy Kaunas story. The Jewish population, which made 30% of Kaunas residents, was absolutely killed in the Kauno ghetto or deported. Lithuanian elites were deported to Siberia. And at the end of July, at the end of summer 44, the rest of the creative society emigrated to Germany because of the coming Soviet army again. And in 45, Vilnius was made the capital of the Lithuanian Soviet Socialist Republic. So what remained for Kaunas? A lot of buildings that were planned were not built anymore, and Kaunas was made the second largest city and heavy industry center. But architectural significance endured even after the loss of Lithuanian independence in 1940. During the years of Soviet occupation that followed World War II, the modernist architectural heritage of interwar Kaunas became a memorial to independent state as well as an exemplary standard of quality. And if you can follow this, it's the same square from the 30s and new construction in the 60s and 70s, just follow the same stylistic, the same line. Although many architects flew Lithuania and ended up in the United States, but still the school was strong. The school was already created, and they followed the mastership of their teachers. And it's interesting to follow how the new houses or new buildings were planned, with, for example, with the respect for this Resurrection Church, which was converted into the radio factory during the Soviet occupation. And all the new buildings, they in a way follow the volumes, the materials, the design from the 30s, although in a new manner. And this photograph was made last year for the UNESCO nomination of Kaunas Modernism. And you can hardly distinguish which buildings were built in the 30s and which were built in the 30s. So we can say that it's a continuation. And we were very strongly promoting that Kaunas could be inscribed not only because of its 30s modernism, but its continuation into the 60s, or the second modernism. But locally, this idea was not very welcomed, and it still presents only this happy story of the 30s. Importance of Kaunas also can be seen in this very, I would say, heartily photograph by known photographer Romualdas Požerskis, because it's 89, and this longing for the independence they never ended in Kaunas. You can see the restoration of the monument to freedom, the same monument that was built in 28, but then was taken up by the Soviets, and people just finished to do it. And it is 1 year before the official independence of Lithuania was announced. So in Kaunas it happened, these events coincided with the breakage of the Berlin Wall immediately. What happens now? Modernity has been rediscovered somehow, and even on its way to UNESCO. European Heritage Label was given in 2015, and the UNESCO City of Design was awarded to Kaunas in 2015. And what's interesting that European Capital of Culture 2022 installed a special program for architecture, which is called Modernist for the Future, and it's not often that European Capital of Culture uses architecture as also a main topic for culture. You can see a lot of workshops, excursions, projects, exploring, re-exploring, interpreting in different manners of modernism, of Kaunas Modernism. So it's a happy story. And you can see that the nomination file, also we were preparing it using already this concept of optimism. It doesn't say that, it's very, it has a geopolitical, it has historical aspects also. What we can read in architecture of Kaunas, all the East Central European story of the interwar. But of course it meets technical problems. The restoration, for example, one of the main features, for example, how to deal with this mastership. The quality was very good, the quality of construction, which sometimes doesn't meet the contemporary qualities. Developmental pressures. The main square that was preserved or respected even during the Soviet occupation now experiences much worse conditions under this new development. Of course, some villas, some houses also experience developmental pressures. And you can see that the community of boroughs, of certain neighborhoods, became very active in protecting this interwar modernism or interwar architecture, and this demolition of this villa was stopped, went to the court, won the court, and now the person who owns it and who wanted to demolish it has to rebuild it according to back to the state it was before. Natasha asked me to comment, but what is about this second modernism, the 60s modernism? In a way, it's a happy story also, because it showed the resilience to Soviet standardization. And people, both architects and people, were very proud about it. We made interviews with architects of this period, and they all told stories that it was their cultural resistance to keep up with the interwar period Kaunas or to look only to the West. And of course, we have all those stories, positive stories about Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, the Baltic states of the Soviet Union, making this Soviet West, or small, cozy countries that were not subjected to the Soviet standardization. Although those stories are positive, there are problems, of course. And one of the first is ideological interpretation, because the interwar period is a good period of nation building, and the Soviet period is, of course, negatively interpreted as a period of occupation. And I think in this case, this decolonizing even the former Soviet Republic architecture and art is important. We have discussions with professionals that the main question is it ours or is it Soviet? And if it's Soviet, it's not ours. But there is a pragmatic need, as it was in the 30s and 20s in Kaunas. You saw that there were conflicting buildings from the ideological point of view, but they were somehow reinterpreted and reused, like the Orthodox Church. So you can see that in Kaunas, the good architecture of former political education house, political communist education, we must say, was adapted to the university premises. Or in Vilnius, the former Lithuanian Communist Party Central Committee headquarters now house the Lithuanian government. And you can only ask the employees if they feel the ghost of communism wandering the corridors. But, many of you could have visited the National Gallery of Art in Vilnius, which is actually the converted Museum of Revolution, which was designed in the 60s and built in the 80s. Or the Opera and Ballet Theatre in Vilnius, designed by a female architect, Nijolė Bučiūtė, still is the place of very good, very well appreciated by the citizens. Even the Palace of Weddings, which from my point of view is the par excellence example of what was socialist modernism, because it's a building, modernist building, that could only emerge in the socialist society because for this need of new secular rituals. But rituals are very essential things with people. And after the Declaration of Independence, when the church was rehabilitated, and Lithuania is a Catholic church, Catholic country, 80% signed that they are Catholics, people started to go for weddings back to the church. And it was the expectation that these buildings won't be needed. And we even proposed to convert it to the city museum, but because of its contested history, because it is built on the Lutheran cemetery. But when we got the results of attendance, we understood that it's very actively used by new secular urban dwellers of Vilnius, and it is still in use. So this tradition got the real new tradition. Now, when we talk about the developmental pressure, we can very clearly see when the Soviet adjective is used in a negative way and when the Soviet adjective is used in a positive way. When there's a need to demolish the building, it's a Soviet monster. When there's a need to renovate the building, it's a building of interesting architecture or socialist period brutalism, which puts us into the European or world brutalist history. So this is the story of the sports palace and palace of sports and concerts, which during the open house Vilnius week really got a lot of attention. And in 2006 it was by developers wanted to demolish it. Now it's on the heritage list. It's visited by the new generation. New generation has very good affiliation with it. But during these fights for preservation or demolition, people come and fighting about what's Soviet, good or not. Could it produce a good architecture even if it's designed by local architects? People forgot that it was built on the Jewish cemetery. And now completely new problems arise. Because on the former Jewish cemetery you cannot do anything. And there were ideas that it can be converted into the conference halls, entire conference center. But new construction cannot be there. So the newest and the most secret idea is to dedicate it for the Jewish museum, probably. But because of its architecture, it have to be approved by the Jewish community. So usually all those histories of buildings are layered. When I talk about the new generation, I want to present very shortly this project. What you can see in this slide is this actually. It's Panevėžys, the fifth city of Lithuania. And it's modernist building construction, which Elena Staškutė, the architect who defended her thesis in Brussels, she proposed to have the collection of modernist architecture. When we have collections of modernist paintings in galleries, why can't we have an urban collection? And she did this research and also proposed the excursion that it's very well located and you can see. But I will finish with the geopolitical issues again. Because by the 2012, let's say, just before the Crimean invasion, Russian invasion on Crimea, we thought that Soviet past is a history. And we, in a way, reconciled with it. It had to be began to be listed on the National Heritage List, interpretations, excursions, conferences, reuse projects, renovation projects. Somehow people started to look at it from irony with the normal research approach as it is a normal historical period which has ended, and now we must make an account of it. But after the Russian invasion into Crimea, the people actually panicked that it is not history. It's still ongoing. It's still ongoing, and it hasn't finished. And you can see that in 2014, architect Audrius Ambrasas proposed a very interesting artistic project on the Stalinist period sculptures on the bridge in Vilnius. And it's interesting that these sculptures were not taken out in 1991, when this first wave of the decommunization happened, because they were not treated as dangerous. They were artistic, they were allegories of the futures of the society. But there were 4 groups of sculptures, but one group contained Red Army soldiers, as you can see. So he proposed to cage them, to leave them, but to cage them, and to show our response to what happened. And actually they were caged in 2015, but for completely other reasons. They were just removed from this bridge in a very, very similar manner, because they were heavy sculptures. So now I think I would like to finish with this photograph. I don't need to comment on it, you recognize it very well from the news. And I think that these events give a very dangerous feeling for the local societies, for the neighboring countries. We in Lithuania perceive as the attack on us too. But this vulnerability also affects not only monuments, which were mostly loaded with politics and ideology, but also in the built environment. And I think this happy story of dealing with Soviet past and Soviet heritage, which was seemingly very positive in 2012, before the 2000, even up till February 24 this year, now starts to be very vulnerable also. So that's the food for thought. Thank you.
Thank you, Marija, for your lecture. I knew a little bit about Kaunas and about the second modernism because I was in Kaunas for the first time 3 weeks ago, and was really, I was a passionate reader of all the publications of the Vienna conference. I don't know how familiar or near this is to the audience, but maybe somebody has some question. No? Because I have actually one or two, because I was there a few weeks ago, as I said, that I was visiting the National Gallery and a few other museums, and also heard a lot of stories. So I understand anti-Soviet sentiment, and that you somehow related to the also contemporary imperialist politics of Vladimir Putin, although he himself in his public speech to the nation of 24th of February this year, actually accused Lenin himself for giving independence to Ukraine. So for somehow in some other parts of the world, even Europe, with different kind of historical experience, a different story of socialist experience also, this kind of brings even more layered kind of approach to this, but I mean, we cannot really find the feelings of the local people. But I saw that this kind of putting equations between Soviet and Russian still creates weird things in interpretation of the 20th century art. For example, the mentioned photographer Veronica
Šleivytė.
that we saw, it's a fascinating artist, photographer, conceptual artist, who was actually, she reminded us a little bit of Nastaroitz, but later on, 3 decades later, because she was actually very much playing with gender, and somehow we would say she was kind of queer artist also. But it's interesting that in the text describing the exhibition, it's really this construction. I mean, I don't know if it's a translator's mistake or not, but it says Veronica, who was a conceptual artist still then, and then she became weird Soviet artist painting only flowers. Because I would say this is a conceptual, very interesting practice, but this was the official thing. I noticed several of this kind of interpretation in this, and so my question is, don't you think that actually layering is needed also in interpretation of this kind of art, and I mean art history, and also some sort of, we know that they're all affective beings, but somehow really insist on somehow using also different vocabulary describing these practices? It's a complicated question.
Yeah, it's complicated. Not a single answer, yes or no. But of course, I'm a supporter of layering. Sometimes this layering can be very unpleasant. For example, like the ending of the Kaunas story in 41, 42, 43, when Kauno ghetto was installed. Of course, it was installed by the Nazi Germany because Lithuania was occupied by it, but it had local collaborators. And for me, as an architectural historian, one moment was very sensitive. I was showing several designs by the most famous Lithuanian modernists of the interwar period, Vytautas Landsbergis Žemkalnis, and 2 of his construction engineers, Solomon Mill and Anatoly Rosenblum, were Jewish by ethnicity. And they were both put into the Kauno ghetto. And then you can see that the same collaborators who created the same optimistic architecture suddenly, abruptly differentiated. Both survived a happy story, but very few. But we have a lot of death dates of other Jewish architects of Kaunas, which ends in 42, 41, 42, 41. So somehow one layer was eliminated. And then with this second Soviet occupation, again, you had deportations, and people tend to have happy stories or positive stories, especially when we talk about heritage. I work a lot in heritage, with heritage theory and practice. It is very difficult to sell a negative story as a reason for protection or for interpretation. So therefore we have this discussion about how to brand Kaunas Modernism for the UNESCO. And several visiting professors and myself, we promoted this continuation because the full story should be told. But the major of decision makers said, we stay with the happy story as an optimistic way.
This was exactly. Yes, I knew that this would raise a question. Yes, actually, go ahead. What do you say?
Thanks. Thank you very much. So I was in Kaunas for the biennial, which was done by Paulina Pukita.
Yeah, that was very
Francesca.
important one. Yeah.
So it was something completely different that I never expected to have so much optimism because it was amazing and I liked it, of course. So I would like to ask you, how would you define this optimism? Because it is obviously we all share quite similar white modernism, which brings, of course, nice new buildings, but the interiors were of a different kind. I mean, for me now, it's really interesting to hear that this is kind of branding of Kaunas as a happy city, as giving some positive thoughts to be recognized despite of the historical facts. So how would you define what was optimism? And put ahead for the moment this branding. I just want to hear more about it because from my point of view, even though the city is absolutely amazing, the layers, especially the history with the Jewish people, it's far away from optimism, and it's really very hard to deal with such history. I mean, for any of us, of course, we share the similar stories here in former Yugoslavia, but there it was obvious in a different way, I would say. Thank you.
Well, I think that the main line behind the optimism is this enthusiastic construction of finally our own modern city. And this optimism prevailed before the catastrophe or the great tragedy. And in a way, it very much consolidated the first generation of this Lithuanian independent state. And this speed and the number of new modern buildings is telling very much. So I think this was the optimism, that was post-imperial optimism, I would say, which connects a lot of new nation states that appeared very quickly in Europe. We know that 26 new currencies just emerged and new borders. So I think it's the very common element that happened in rebuilding or renewing the capital cities of these new states. But it was very short because of the...
No, because it's interesting, at the same moment we have a very specific aesthetics in photography in the post-war period, which is called photography of boredom.
Yeah.
So, I mean, this is, two parts of the scale. Interesting, yeah, thank you.
What is the practice of I'm interested in the current practice of putting post-war modernism on heritage list. I suppose there are problems or reluctance about it. Can you go back on willingness to protect this optimistic story? And I suppose you have some kind of legislation similar to ours, as heritage lists, a Ministry of Culture or something.
Yeah. In any case, I think that Lithuania is a champion in listing Soviet modernism. I think 50 buildings are listed. Even the urban planning, like Lazdynai mass housing area, which was awarded the Lenin Prize in '74 as a very progressive within the entire Soviet Union. So, and this speed, of course, gained in 2010, 2012. Now it's declining, or they stay on the list. But what's interesting, about 20 buildings were already listed in 84 and 85, still during the Soviet period. And this listing has a very interesting story behind, because in 87 there was preparation for the 70th anniversary of Communist Revolution from 1917, and all countries had to present the lists of their achievements during the socialist period. And since Baltic countries were latest incorporated only after 45, they had to put on the list something that was achieved. But the list, the selection was done very professionally. Really good buildings were selected. But what's strange about it, all the authors were living and they were on the board. So they listed themselves in fact. But Independent Lithuania inherited this list. They looked through and they said, but it's good architecture. So can we keep it on the list? Yes, so they are still on the list. But now this increase stopped, of course. And yeah, but it's still very well listed, very well protected, and yeah.
Not like
No, probably not.
Hello. I want to ask you about this younger architects generation that traveled abroad and then came back, and how much did they influence the modernism? How much could they work even on it? Did the state commission most of the works, or they worked? They could have their own projects, and then they commissioned them to some architectural, I don't know, places. I mean, in the city itself, and in this polar exterior and interior motifs and decorations, did they have any? Were they included in designing the spaces, or just the building itself? And also, is that interior identity only connected with the richer population, or the other also parts of the city? I mean, I have a few questions,
Okay.
but I'm interested mostly in this younger generation of architects and their direct influence on modernism and this interior and exterior design situation. Thank you.
I mean, architects even today often say that the project is confluence of their ideas and the wishes of the clients, I suppose. But Marija.
Yeah, but that's a very good question. And I'm for 25 years in this business. So I can follow the line. And what's interesting, I can say that young generation of architects is fascinated by the 60s modernism as a very clean spaces, but they look at it as a retro. They do not have any feelings for that. I mean, ideological or not, is it bad memories or good memories? They do not relate it. They do look at it aesthetically. And therefore, yes, they try to preserve or reinterpret or reuse details, materials. But they do not have such an affiliation to the 30s modernism of Kaunas. But in the 30s modernism of Kaunas, it's mostly restorers are employed. So they look professionally, what should be restored, etc., etc., etc. So yeah, we can say that it's generational, the approaches. Whereas restorers would come to the Palace of Sports and they would say there's nothing to preserve. So it's generational. And when I was a young art historian and I was first entered the board of this monument selection, I was very fond of the 60s modernism, and I said, yeah, we need to protect it, and it's by our architects, etc. But you know, when I look, I see that, and we were very critical about the time span or census of 50 years for a building to become heritage. Younger buildings cannot even apply for the heritage list. And we said, but during this period, everything will be demolished and we will not have anything from the 60s and 70s, and we should. But the older I become, I think that it's very reasonable to have the time span, because it's better when you do not have a very the first generation shouldn't decide. You know about the post-Nazi processes that only the third generation had strength and will to decide or to do. So I think in the post-traumatic societies, or maybe still traumatic societies, it's sensitive.
Okay, any questions, or we go easy somewhere else to discuss more? No more questions, right? There is one more from Transnistria, so we will give you the chance.
Yeah, my question about this decolonization that you mentioned, because I have some feeling that now this decolonization is new colonization. I mean, especially when I see where topics born and where they spread. I mean, like when we criticize standardization from one side and say that exists some standardization that was green for example, from Moscow. I see now other standardization that also like have kind of this dictatorship of topics, narratives, and even words and formulations. So this my question about this really like how to say how it's possible real decolonization or decommunization, because what I see, for example, now in during war happens real decolonization, is decommunization. When we see when completely already disappearing infrastructures and structures, so it's not about even symbolical soldiers or monuments of Lenin. We see that it happens when just disappear all this infrastructure. And we, for example, now I see in Moldova, in Transnistria, this problematical region in political sense, that for me, end of this Soviet period happens now, because I know that before it was keeping some resources, infrastructures, some economical connections, and that only with such violent things happens. Maybe already. What about? I hear about this. So it's this question. What is the decolonization, and what we ready to pay for this? And, yes, and from where it's coming.
Okay, I think I can comment on that.
Interesting question.
Of course, this escaping the empire is painful, and nobody probably expected that the price would be such thing, and it still has its flaws. But we had a discussion with the Ukrainian researchers about this, and they proposed interesting interpretation that these mass housing districts and areas are a very strong symbol of colonization, and why? And they say that when Russians attack the housing, mass housing areas, they claim that it's their heritage, and that's why we belong to them. But the decolonization process, what they try to explain, but when we start to perceive it as ours, because our Ukrainian architects designed it differently and solved different problems, and they did it like this, then we will understand that it's not there. And this is what I was trying to tell, how these two narratives also in Lithuania, if we accepted that it is our design by Lithuanian architects, following different values and different traditions, and which is more, if we put it on the scale, which is more important, or we, of course, if we say that it's a colonial project, it was fully imposed by Moscow, built and funded by Moscow, of course we need to get rid of it. It is very, very, now this narrative is used by developers when they want to change this, especially the housing area. So I saw the question of decolonization in this matter. So how much is it a colonial project, or how much national republics had their own input in it and how they perceive it now?
Maybe we could really go on for hours like this, because I would have so many questions, and we don't have so much events, but we have somebody from the Baltic states also present, and now we are like really excited about asking you everything. But I think just Max said that every time has its self-censorships. And I know, since I was working a lot in post-Soviet states like Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, Armenia, that in relation to how the young cultural operators are speaking, it's like reproducing EU agenda without even going through like public space, something like, you know, like not even somehow going into the concept, what was this kind of state or social, or, you know, the history of public space in there. I mean, it's very much done with, as Mark suggested, another type of colonization, let's say. So this was, I think, more the comment. Yeah, it's a very, very layered history, I would say, and I mean, this war in Ukraine brings it another tension and more affects and less rationality, I suppose. So, I don't know, let's hope very soon we will be able to speak even in more rational terms, but actually this is the illusion. We are actually emotional people, so I don't know, let's go out and speak about emotions, politics of feelings, how our personal emotions are formed by social realities and other interesting topics. Thank you all for coming.